So let's talk about our yarn. Did everybody like their yarn this month?
Love it.
Yes.
Love it.
Very good. I'm super pleased with the colorway and working with the dyer that we worked with. It's dyed by Asylum Fibers, and she also dyed our Festivus yarns this year. So everybody's in for a treat. And she dyed the Mother's Day yarn as well, which everybody loved. So
Good.
we love her, and we'll be doing more projects with her. Just love her.
Where is
Just
she
really-
located?
She's in New York. She's in, it might be Long Island, but it could be slightly upstate from the city. I can't remember exactly now. I just really like her too. She's easy to talk to. She gets what we're describing. And hang on a second, I'm going to turn the light on because I thought I could get away with natural light, but it's clouding over outside. It kind of bugs me. That's better. That's better. So I, went to her with this, we're going to be introducing this during the fall equinox. And I love that very deep blue of the evening sky at that time of year. It comes a little bit earlier, so you can really enjoy it while I can enjoy it while I'm walking the dogs. And she just hit it on the head, like the first chance, the first stab at it. So I just really like it. And then of course, different skeins are different. Like Barb's skein that she did, Barb knit the Spiraluscious mitts in it. Like, look how saturated that is. And then my socks are saturated, but not nearly,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they are, but hers is more.
Yeah.
So there's some variation between the skeins. For those that ordered multiple skeins, we always try to match the skeins to each other before they go out as much as we can. But the yarn is sold out now. And one thing about this yarn that I just want to warn people about is that it's very round and dense. And I found with the socks, it used a lot more yardage than I expected. And that will happen with different yarns that you're working with. So in the sock pattern yardage is tailored to this yarn. So you should have enough to knit, medium length socks in the sizes indicated with your the way it's described in the pattern. But if you're using the yarn for other patterns, be aware that you might use more than the stated yardage for your pieces. Like if you're knitting a sweater that calls for 1400 yards, you may need another, you may need a more. And I'm just throwing that out there. That was my experience. It may not be everybody's experience. And I think the culprit in this case is that the yarn is so round, it makes, bigger stitches. And to that end, I was able to get like a sock gauge on a much smaller needle. So it's definitely a yarn you want to swatch before you start and make sure you're getting the right gauge on the needles. And if you do have to go to a smaller needle, that can compensate for the extra amount of yarn you might need, if that makes sense. I don't want anybody to panic. It's just, that's my experience. I just want to warn people ahead of time that keep that in mind when you're picking a project. Don't plan on playing yarn chicken. That might not work out with this yarn.
So if you are playing yarn chicken going down a needle size, will maybe make the yarn go farther rather than up? I would have thought the other way because I'm dim.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, getting in the correct gauge is always important. So what I was saying is you might have to go down a needle size to get the correct gauge
Ah,
because the
Okay,
stitches are bigger. Like in my socks, I was using a size 1 needle for the foot and still my stitches per inch was only like, I think 7 or 7.5 stitches per inch, which is unusual for me with a sock yarn.
okay.
Usually with a sock yarn and a size 1 needle, I get 8 stitches per inch, which is pretty dense. So I needed less stitches to do my sock, which
Okay.
in itself makes your yarn go a little further. I was just making I was making big socks for David. So I ran out.
Was there
If they
much change in the wash versus pre-wash versus after wash swatch? Change much?
Only in that it does flatten out, and it's very lively yarn. There's a lot of twist in it. So the knitted fabric might look kind of uneven, and then when you wash it, it gets that nice consistency without losing the stitch definition that you crave. So for instance, with this Spiraluscious, I mean, the ribs really stand out. You know, you can see that the texture is really good. And even the sock has a very subtle texture. It's not standout. And this is like the one yarn you could probably get away with this kind of a pattern. It's just a little back and forth twist stitch, cable-y looking rib. And I've tried this. I always liked the subtle shifts of this pattern. And I've tried it with lots of different yarns for other projects, and it never was satisfying until I did it with this yarn. So I've been saving this stitch pattern for quite a long time for the right yarn to come along and marry with it, you know. I was looking for a subtle pattern that kind of described the shifts of atmosphere in the sky and, you know, light waves traveling through different densities of atmosphere are what make the stars twinkle and what make heat waves, you know, appear or mirages appear. And I just kind of wanted to, in my personal headspace, I was going for that kind of shifting appearance that a heat wave or a light wave might have. Not that I know exactly what light waves look like, but anyway, those are, you know, 2 nice accessories that we knit up. And then, I mean, this yarn is super sturdy. So this will make really great socks and mitts and, you know, sweaters. It reminds me of I don't know even if this yarn is marketed anymore, but there used to be a yarn marketed by some Scottish or Irish company that, you know, distributed it here in the United States, and it was specifically spun for Gansey sweaters.
Oh.
And it was a lightweight yarn, a fingering yarn like this. I don't want to say it was lightweight because it was super dense. I think it was 5 plies and spun really and twisted really tightly like this. And the whole purpose of it was to wear like iron and last a lifetime, because traditionally Gansey sweaters are work sweaters that are worn, you know, by fishermen on boats that are working hard. And in fact, they even a freshly knit Gansey sweater or gloves will often be nailed down to the dock so that people can walk on it all day, and felt it a little bit to make it even more sturdy. That's an old traditional kind of felting method.
Wow.
And this yarn kind of reminds me of that. I've only seen it a couple times in student projects, but I've never actually knit with it myself. But this yarn reminds me of it, and I like it very much. And it takes dye like nobody's business. So it's, you know, it's possible at some point that we might do something with this yarn. It doesn't come in shades, but you know, maybe possibly we would do maybe a set of colors or something. It's very interesting. And don't take that as gospel. That's just me with ideas flying through my head. I just really like it. If you're like me and you knit to wear things, you want these kinds of yarns in your arsenal because they're really great for knitting for kids and knitting that everyday sweater that you want to just throw on every day and work outside in, or for socks if you want sock yarn that doesn't have that isn't superwash and doesn't have, you know, lots of chemicals on it. This is a good choice. So the base itself is untreated, and of course the dye is I believe she's using acid dyes, so they're not super toxic. They're but it is dyed in this case, so there is that extra layer of chemical on it. So the wool base is Peruvian Highland, and I'll say right off the bat, this was the most difficult research I've ever done for any of these Barn Box chats or chapters in any of our books. There's like practically no information out there about this sheep breed in terms of the usual things we like to talk about. So I'm taking the discussion in a slightly different direction to, you know, after I present the minimal material I could find. So Peruvian Highland is a sheep breed that it's a cross between Merino and Corriedale. And Corriedale is a cross between Merino and Lincoln. So it's kind of a comeback sheep, like we talked about with the Polworth, where they cross the Merino with the Romney, right? Romney, and brought it back on top of the Merino. So it's like a 3/4 Merino, 1/4 Lincoln cross. It's a good sheep for the climate and the region where it's raised, because it's very adaptable. You know, the Lincoln is a very strong sheep, a large sheep, a strong sheep with strong genetics. And we've talked about that before, where the genetics of the Lincoln are very assertive and kind of easy to control in breeding. And so, and it's very adaptable to a lot of different situations. So it is often used in crossbreeds. And so this sheep has adapted really well to the high altitudes where it's raised, and the harsh conditions, the lack of food and the lack of quality food, and still produces a fine soft wool as well as a good meat carcass. The wool tends to be, you know, an average of like 27 microns. So that puts it squarely in a medium soft range, with a staple length that's longer than Merino would be. So it's easier to spin, it's easier to use, and it has a little more sturdiness for everyday yarns. The Lincoln long wool genes also contribute, in addition to the extra staple length and strength, a little bit of luster to this yarn. It's not a lot. It's just a bit. In our case, it's dyed. I would like to get some of this undyed just to see how it looks and feels, but it does have enough sheen to highlight the stitch work in a piece, and that's good. Let's see. Again, because of those luster genes in the fiber, it takes dye really well and amplifies color beautifully with its kind of reflective quality. So it gives you both the saturation of a softer wool and the the shine and I'm talking about color now, the depth of color that makes, you know, a shade kind of gaze worthy, I guess I like to say, where you really end up looking at your skein, you know, and thinking, wow, look at that color and look at that streak there. And, you know, so pretty. At the same time that it has that sturdiness, it does feel good next to your skin. And this particular construction, this tight twist construction, and it is a 2-ply. The nice thing about tight twist is that it folds all the little yarn, all the little fiber ends into the yarn so that they're not poking out and fuzzy. And, you know, that's one of the things that can irritate people's skin, is just the fact that a yarn is more fuzzy and smooth yarns are more comfortable. Let's see. So that's about the most I could come up with in terms of like consistent information about the actual sheep. The thing about Highland, and particularly in the Andes and the region and the Highland regions of the what they call the Altiplano in Latin and South America, is that the people that are raising sheep there are often, I don't know why, but they're the kinds of breeds and they're really, their whole way of life just hasn't been studied and recorded that much. The people themselves are not necessarily able to do that. And there's been very little, especially little modern writing about this, about sheep breeding in this area, because alpaca breeding has kind of overshadowed it. So even though alpaca represent only about 25% of the livestock raised in the Peruvian highlands, the product is so much more covetable and desirable that the focus in terms of marketing and research about it has really been mostly based on the camelid population. But people in the highlands rely heavily on sheep for many aspects of their own life. So almost 86% of the Peruvian Andes and Bolivian highlands are exclusively used as rangelands. And this has led to a special, a really unique way of life for many of the population there. It has, you know, a historical, a cultural, and a geographical significance, especially in Bolivia and Peru. And this way of life is called pastoralism. And basically it's people who live off the pasture land, as opposed to, I think way early in our club, you know, discussions, way back in the books, we discussed the nomadic lifestyle and as it related to camelids and cashmere goats. And for anyone here who has been doing this that long and remembers those chapters, the nomadic way of life is similar but different in that those people travel seasonally from up and down the mountain ranges, from highlands to lowlands, and they, you know, bring their animals with them on these long drives. In pastoralism, people are really setting down roots in a place and working out ways to put together livestock flocks and stations that work. It's a little bit more like what we talked about in the Australian mountain ranges or in New Zealand, where in the mountains, people would claim large areas of land and run, large numbers of sheep on them. This is a little bit more like that, except that these people are cultivating their entire livelihood from what they're doing in that place. So in the high Andes regions, and we're talking about people that are living and working at 5,000 meters above sea level or more. Again, the habitat is known as the Altiplano, or Puna is another word for it. The pastoralism, the mountain pastoralism is largely concentrated in the semi-arid regions of the Andes. And pastoral activity in Latin America, including, bridging Central America and South America, is concentrated in that region and across 4 different countries: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru. Pastoralism in Latin America is heavily linked to the wool market. So while camelid fibers claim higher value in the plains region, and vicuña being the most sought after, and anyone who's curious about that can go back into the ebooks from our previous clubs. I have a couple different chapters or 3 about alpaca and Suri alpaca that are really extensive and go into all the prehistoric and historic, descriptions of those animals. So even though the camelids are higher value, sheep are still the most numerous livestock. And the ratio is approximately like 20 million sheep versus 7 million camelids. And the reason is their wool and meat are easy to market. In Argentina alone, sheep are, and this is, this is unusual, but sheep are mainly raised for their wool, 50% of which is exported on the global market. So that, if you've been listening along for a while, you know that I say over and over, most people don't raise sheep for the value of their wool because it doesn't have any value. But in this case, that's actually the opposite. Meat is also exported. Mutton is a good high protein food. And interestingly, not much of the meat is kept among the people who raise it. They actually have a prejudice against mutton, believing it. Many mothers believe that it is not good to eat mutton because it has parasites. So they worry about that it's not healthy. So mutton actually makes up like a tiny percentage of their diet, which is not a diet that's high in protein to begin with. So I forget now. I did read the percentages, and I was kind of staggered by how little they keep of this very available protein food. But that's their tradition, and that's what they do. So these high altitude regions are very difficult areas to grow crops. And that's why people there rely so heavily on animals. They can grow some potatoes and sweet potatoes and garlic and onions, but growing green vegetables is almost impossible. So they do, they can grow a little bit of crop for themselves, but it's not anything they can export. Like in parts of South America where they grow fruit, for instance, we get that fruit during the winter, the reason we can have apples all year round is that a lot of them come from South America or Latin America. And they can be really delicious, or New Zealand. But at this altitude, you can't even grow those things. So there's two models of farming in this pastoralist context. One is communal and the other is individual farming practices. And there's a big difference between there's a big difference between almost every level of raising animals between the two. So for instance, communal groups of people have a far more likely chance of developing a breeding program that's based on data and results rather than letting animals breed however they like. And that was part of the difficulty of researching this Peruvian Highland breed. It began to appear more and more that this is like a generic term almost that applies in some people's minds to just about any crossbreed that lives in the Andean highlands. So there are other sheep breeds that people raise, and just like alpacas, historically, there's a lot of infiltration and crossbreeding that has occurred that is unaccounted for. So while that can strengthen an animal's constitution in some ways, it can also blur the intentional reasons that you crossbreed animals. If you're crossbreeding for a better meat production and you're using Lincoln sheep, that's a good choice. And keeping records and data about it will lead you to an optimal carcass size and all of that. But if you're just letting the ewes breed sometimes with the Lincoln and then every once in a while with a Corriedale, you're not going to end up with the same results, and it's going to be very hard to figure out why. Okay, let's see. The lifestyle of pastoralism is often looked down upon, which is I don't understand it. There doesn't seem to me to be a huge difference between this way of life and many other ways of life that people who raise animals can take up. But it's possible that one of the reasons is that they gravitate to raising livestock of mixed livestock systems. So they'll have some sheep and some camelids, some alpacas, and some cattle, so that they have kind of a economic range that they're producing. And pastoralists tend to focus on conventional livestock like cattle and sheep and goats rather than specialized livestock like cashmere goats, which and again alpacas and vicuñas, which you almost have to be a nomadic. You almost have to be nomadic people to be chasing those particular pots of gold, because those animals can only thrive and produce in very particular areas that you have to travel to get product from them. And in many places, in many places are very limited as to who can even go in and out of those areas, because there's a big desire not to infiltrate those areas with other types of animals or or a variety of bacteria or germs or even plant life that will disturb the ability of, for instance, vicuña to graze. And so pastoralists are content to raise more traditional animals that are easier to take care of in one place that they can put down roots and stay. Let's see. Within the pastoralist community, over 80% of the animals that are raised in communal settings. So you might have anywhere from 3 to 20 families come together in a complex of buildings and barns and stables to manage a community flock of sheep, a community herd of cattle, and community herd of goats. And that way they can split amongst them what the products that they're going to keep, and they can benefit communally from what they're going to sell. So selling product will often be, the money will often be turned back into, for instance, buying semen from overseas, from Australia or New Zealand, to improve the flock of their sheep, to improve the birth rates or the ovulation rates of the sheep that they're raising, which, by the way, due to the climate and the harsh conditions and the low quality food, there are such challenges in raising animals at these altitudes. Ovulation in particular is a big concern. It's like a 50% fail rate right off the bat before you even conceive, before you can even get a sheep to conceive. And many sheep go several years without producing offspring. And then the ability to produce twins is greatly reduced, and so on and so forth. Infant death among lambs is high. And so I'll get into this a little bit later, but world organizations or NGOs have been working in these areas since the 50s and 60s, since they really became accessible to the outside world, to help people, to observe and help people figure out ways that they can improve their herds and flocks.
So that makes it sound, Anne, like these are more like indigenous peoples that are.
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't like your gentleman farmer from Great Britain going down there to have a big farm, like you did see with some of the Australian and New Zealand sheep that we talked about earlier. This isn't people migrating on an adventure or to find a new way of life or to have land in a place compared to home where they can't get any. This definitely is indigenous life, but influenced though by the Spaniards. So these communities were organized and created by the Spaniards in the 1700s to facilitate tax collection and kind of speed the flow of manpower back to the government. So to make sure that profits garnered money for the government. Communities pooled their productive land and organized funds, so that they could keep at least some of what they made and not have it all stripped away by the Spanish government. That said, so much of what was sucked out of them, between the 1700s and the 1900s, led to them diverting resources into just staying alive instead of putting it back into the land. And so some of the land became overgrazed, and but more importantly, they were unable to build and improve their flock qualities. So the flock quality. So being able to have, maybe at that point, the idea of buying semen from overseas wasn't something that they did, but buying livestock from other communities further away was something that they did, and they just couldn't always make that happen if so much of their profit was going back to the government. And because of that, communities that kept camelids initially gradually began replacing them with cattle and sheep, which were easier to grow, and that triggered a reduction in native species and a loss of biodiversity and a decline in the flexibility to respond to the constraints of the ecosystem that they work in. So, and this went on this happened over a couple of centuries, but if you recall, it's something that has happened in other parts of the world that we've discussed. In Australia, for instance, some areas became so overgrazed that Highland sheep were introduced into the breeding programs to create new breeds of sheep that could graze on less food and less quality food. And the same thing kind of happened here. There are other unique breeds to this region that we're not focusing on with this installment, but one of them is called a Criollo, and that's kind of a sheep that has Corriedale and this Hunin breed and Merino all mixed in, and it's just like our human Creoles. It's this incredible mix that is partly accidental and partly due to circumstances and partly scientifically managed, so that it's a hardy sheep that can live on the land and produce a reasonable amount of wool and meat to meet the demands of the people. In the 1970s, and a lot of the papers I came across concerning life in this area and the kind of sheep that they raise were researched and written in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I found very little research after the 90s. So I can't even conjecture why that is. But there are, so some of the information that I found is quite dated. I'm sure if animal researchers went back in today and did, worked a little more on this, there'd be some really interesting developments happening. I know for a fact that since the time of the research I was able to uncover, just in the market, the people of South America, the people who raise animals, are becoming more and more a part of the competitive global market. I mean, you have to, but just in terms of making our own yarns, we know that some really beautiful product is coming out of Peru in terms of alpaca and even wool, not wool that we use necessarily, but really clean, really well prepared alpaca fiber that is de-haired and everything. I mean, they're really getting a leg up on what the market is demanding of alpaca fiber, so that people will buy more of it and pay more money. In 1979, the Constitution, the the Peruvian Constitution was rewritten, I believe, and it established a communal and multi-communal enterprise system, or defined it in some way that promoted the formation of, economic labor. Individual farmers can still maintain their operations, or they can form groups to set up family farms and livestock communities, so that they can manage their resources more efficiently. Let's see. These rural communities can use the products from their livestock as they can use them for consumption. They can use them for a medium of exchange. In other words, sell it or barter it. They can also use wool and livestock legally as loan collateral and in-kind loan payments. So it's a big enough industry where a bank can take like a full clip as payment on a loan. And they do, like there's enough resources within the country and enough of a system to make that viable and efficient. And then, to a lesser extent, these communities are able to cash in a bit on their resources as cultural, recreational, and tourism activities, which anyone who has had the pleasure of traveling to Peru has, you can get on a tour or hire a guide to take you to the high Andes regions, to explore some of these communities and mills and farms where product is produced, and then on to places, markets where you can purchase goods, and even some less processed materials to take home and knit for yourself or spin for yourself at home. In multi-communal and communal enterprises, the decisions, every decision from breeding to raising to managing the pasture land to marketing and sales is based on it tends to be based more on technical criteria and data, as well as a system developed within the community. So decision making by everyone involved, and recording the results from generation to generation or from year to year leads them to managing their resources more efficiently. Whereas with individual farmers, it's a little more haphazard. Their consumption and sales tend to occur on culturally significant dates, or when they need cash, or when an animal is killed or is in an accident. They garner as much as they can from that animal before it dies, basically. So that's kind of an example of the difference of living one way versus the other. Livestock from these communities is sold mostly to traders, whereas maybe maybe a big ranch in Bolivia would like some livestock from a ranch in Peru to freshen up their genetics, and or bring in sheep with a slightly sturdier trait, or they've noticed something about these sheep, like maybe a particular community is raising sheep with exceptionally soft fiber. Well, other communities are going to want some of those sheep, and even communities in other countries are going to want some of those sheep. And so those sheep because of the size of the flock and the community influence, it's much easier for those communities to deal with brokers and to have someone among them who can do a deal, who can read and write and take care of the money and not get, taken advantage of. Whereas between individual farmers, there's more use of the bartering system for making these kinds of transactions and not transacting far away from home as much. Let's see. The interesting thing is that in the more developed systems, the community enterprises, that allows them also to command better prices, and sometimes, as much as 70% more money for wool, and that's a big difference. That said, I guess some people, just like everywhere, some people prefer to go it on their own, and they can't imagine working with other people, or maybe they're just really far. Maybe their land holdings are not, close enough to other people to do a community system. I don't know the reasons behind it, but it is interesting that it still exists when it's not as profitable. Let's see. And, a lot of the differences extend outward in every direction. So community based systems tend to encourage people to take better care of the land, to avoid degrading their grazed lands, to work around the weather by moving sheep around from higher areas and lower areas depending on the water level, things like that. Community people who work and live in communities tend to be more open to being they tend to be more open to when other people come to teach them mitigation methods. It's true that with climate change, it's very hard to tell people, to tell farmers, you have to get on board and, and do something about climate change. Like, that doesn't really help them. But when you get in there, when organizations and such as universities and NGOs get in there and show people and really talk to them on the level of mitigation, like your springs are more dry. Here are some things you can do. And not only here are some things that you can do to stop the emergency in its tracks, but these things are better ongoing for having consistent water levels throughout the year. So what you see is that teams from organizations that belong to the UN or from universities are big. Even teams from medical communities and veterinarian organizations can go to these places and set up a program, teach people how it works, and check back on it periodically, without interfering too much with the lifestyle that they're trying to help with. This is kind of fun. This is like a little bit off topic, but kind of fun. One of the papers that I read was actually a really cool PowerPoint presentation that was probably like 50 or 60 pages long. And because it had a lot of pictures, not because it was a lot of dense reading. And it was a team that went to Peru from UMass Amherst, which is in kind of Western Massachusetts. And they went there to study alpacas and ended up studying both sheep and alpacas. So they went there to study ovulation rates and birth rates and the ability to use conception rates and to improve conception in the ewes and to figure out what types of improvements would work best. Because for one thing, you can introduce semen from other places to help with that, but it doesn't always work. Sometimes a different, a whole different system works better, maybe something indigenous. So they went there first to study what they were doing and figure out if intervention could work. And the other thing is these communities don't always have money for that. So importing semen from somewhere else, strong semen that makes for better conception and better lambing might be the perfect thing. But if a community can't afford it, it doesn't matter. They can't use it anyway. So something else might have to be developed. Anyway, this paper was written by UMass Amherst has a director of camelid studies, which I just love that. Like, that's someone's job, you know. And he and his small team were, I don't know, it seemed like they were down there for quite a while. I just thought that was a really cool thing. Let's see. Another cool thing about raising fiber animals in this region is that it's very rare for them. It's starting to happen, and at least in the range of dates of the papers I read, most of their clipping is still done with hand shears. So they don't have, because they don't have electricity in a lot of these places. So they have these huge hand clippers that they clip the alpacas and the sheep with. It's really cool. And when they do their shearing, the animals look very rough afterward, because it's all like, you know, it's just not that even mechanical shearing that's done. Let's see. I think that's about, I think I covered everything I have. Let me just, now, you know, in the last few decades, the selection of criterion methods used to raise animals and record their breeding and things like that are being helped along by the state, by universities and NGOs and other institutions. However, it's not, you know, with change of regimes and governments, that kind of help isn't always consistent. So the state is making an effort to be more involved and to support these communities more, and, you know, and especially in an effort to deal with climate change. It makes a lot of sense to to support communities that are not having a heavy footprint on the land, and to improve whatever they can within those communities to make them even more, to give them an optimal chance of retaining a lifestyle in the habitat that they are living in now, because they're not, you know, generation after generation stays in this habitat. They're not suited to other areas of living necessarily. They'd have to like totally revolutionize the way that they lived in order to move to a city or move to a suburb or anything like that. Plus, the way that they live is maintaining a huge area of South America as a natural habitat, which isn't happening in all areas of South America. As you know, the rainforest is really in danger. There's a lot of problems with people who are profiting without any care at all off the land in many parts of South America. So whatever they can maintain in these highland areas is helpful. Sometimes even the government will develop an enterprise to maintain genetic, what they call genetic pyramids, or flock integrity, to help supply their needs. And so they may buy, for instance, in the 70s, the government bought the biggest import of Corriedales from Australia. It was like 100,000 animals to distribute among the communal enterprises. With the and then once they made this one-time investment, that put the communities on more equal footing with the private sector in terms of producing wool and getting into the global market in the 1990s. So an investment in the 70s really began paying off in the 90s and enabled these people to maintain their habitat without, moving around and without being taken over by the private sector, which can cause, kind of unnecessary competition and lead to cutting corners in breeding and things like that. That enabled these communities to then continue their work with their own funding rather than have an ongoing support from the state, which is, that's a great thing. Something that, even here in America, we struggle with farm subsidies that go on and on and on and on because they're not maybe subsidizing the right, or they're not being monitored to subsidize the right system of producing. So that's pretty much what I have. Who has questions? If I can answer that.
Interestingly, I think it was 2003. I was in Bolivia.
Oh yeah.
One of the in the Alta Plateau. I served in the Army for many years, and little known to many people, the Army does medical training exercises in various countries, and Bolivia was one of the ones. And our base camp where we worked from was 14,000 feet. So it was not for the faint of heart in terms of physical, in terms of your physical ability to tolerate altitude at that level. So, and that obviously no supplemental oxygen or anything like that. But I remember the terrain, and I'd have to look up my journal that I kept. The terrain was harsh. It was beautiful, but it was a harsh climate. And I'm thinking this is the trip where one day they loaded us up and took us out to where they were grazing animals. Now, I was a knitter then, but I didn't have time to knit. So now that I'm hearing you talk about all this, I should have paid closer attention.
It's flooding back. Yeah.
But we provided medical treatment to the population, and we always had veterinarians that went along to work with the animals, and very interesting experience. I always come back from those trips just appreciating how much we have here. But the one day we went down to La Paz, which is at 10,000 feet, and we were able to do a little shopping, and the fiber goods that they had for sale in the markets were just incredible. I did a lot of Christmas shopping that year. And we also had the opportunity, I'm thinking this is a trip, to eat fresh fish in a little restaurant on the shores of Lake Titicaca. So I can tell you I had that experience courtesy of the Army. I've had worse experiences, but that one was at least a good one. But indeed, that area is pretty harsh.
How long were you there?
It was like 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
So it was
just enough time to acclimate somewhat, and then
yes. Yeah. And we had to take medication to counter the altitude sickness, but it did take a couple days to acclimate, I will tell you that. But beautiful areas, and I remember Lake Titicaca being just gorgeous as well.
And I know some other people, I don't know if anyone is here who's been there, but Catherine and her and some of her friends, Cynthia and I think Jose went to Peru some years ago now, and had some similar experiences. Yeah. And we also studied years ago cotton that comes from Peru that's grown indigenously. Now that is a completely different kind of fiber. It's a plant fiber, but they grow cotton indigenously that grows in colors, and they grow cotton completely differently than it's grown here. So we talked about cotton in July, so I won't get into it deeply, but it is really interesting that the indigenous methods and the farm methods and the way that they think about resources is already tends to be more climate friendly. Why water a plant when it will grow long roots and get the water for you? Why waste time and money doing that in a climate that's really harsh and where you're unable to get water to plants? And the same thing with sheep. Like, why try to raise fussy, fancy merino sheep in a climate that isn't lush enough with grass for them? Why not breed a variety that will thrive on brush and lower quality food? And that just makes all the sense in the world. But only people who live in those conditions and have no expectation that that's going to change are going to come up with those solutions. The thing about American life is that almost immediately upon settling the country, we went right into the Industrial Revolution full on, and every year there was a new development that by which you could transform your habitat to conform with your idea rather than change yourself to conform with your habitat. And so, that kind of thinking can lead, if it's unmanaged, can lead to stripping off too many resources at once. People who have to depend on their habitat without any expectation that it's going to, that things are going to change, are much more conservative about how they treat their land and their animals.
Well, I'm reading a book now about George Washington and some of his travels when he first became president. And I think some of that industrial piece was to get away from dependence on England for our textiles.
Absolutely.
So it's that counterbalance kind of thing.
What's interesting about that is it never happened. I mean, the more people who lived here, the more industrialization that took place, it caused a higher consumption of wool, for instance. Like, we've never really gotten off, you know, the British wool train. It's so interesting. Peggy Hart, who is a blanket weaver, she weaves blankets on antique mechanical looms, and she shows at all the big shows. I have a bunch of her. I've talked about her before. She's a really cool person. She wrote a book about the American wool story a few years ago. And I can't remember the title exactly, but her last name is Hart, H-A-R-T, and her first name is Peggy. And her company is called Bedfellows Blankets. And it's basically the history of wool in America or something like that. It's got a really plain title like that. It's a great read because first of all, it's very readable, and it moves fairly quickly from, you know, the initial settlers to through the 1950s. And she covers really I don't know how to put it, but it's like a domestic, or it's a domestic history of wool, really. So it's just very interesting. Some of the, you know, there's plenty more where this comes from, but I love the things that she picked to talk about and to represent the different time periods and the reasoning behind things. As you say, you know, we're trying to get off separate ourselves from Great Britain. But in fact, it took like 200 years to have enough wool production here to even accomplish that. It was never really accomplished in full. So we've always relied on other countries for our fiber. Although we do raise a lot of wool in America, and at one point we were in a position to be even exporting it, but of course that has declined in the 20th century, and has remained stable since about the 1960s. Our consumption and production of wool is pretty much the same now as it was in the late 50s. So it has finally evened out, but it's not a good number. Let's put it that way. It's not the greatest number. Anybody else want to say anything, or yes, Julie?
I have two questions. The ebooks that you were talking about from the early on Barn Box collections, are those available anywhere for those of us that are newer?
Yeah, if you go onto our website, let me just go on our website. Hang on. I can't remember if it's under the design tab at the top of the website, or what product.
I've seen ebooks in the pattern collections.
Yeah. So if you go into the menu and you go under designs, the first item is ebooks. And on that page, you'll see all the ebooks from previous clubs. And there's a pretty good description for each one of what's in it, what it covers. and the pattern and the list of patterns included. And the great thing about the ebooks is they're priced at, if you take the price of all the patterns included and take 40% off, that's basically the price of the book. But it, and all the other stuff in the book is free, you know, like all the information is, I guess we decided that would be free.
So the ebooks have patterns and then they have like all this information
Yeah.
about the
Yes.
breeds and the yarns and.
Yeah. So
Okay.
back when, before we did Barn Box, we used to have our yarn clubs, and the clubs were constructed where you paid for the whole thing up front and you got 3 or 6 shipments, depending on the size of the club, over the course, like every other month. The first ones were every month. And I wrote a full size book chapter for each yarn release. So these are full length books.
Okay.
Most of them are over 200 pages each for each club, and include somewhere between 12 and 18 patterns. I mean, there were a couple clubs that had a lot of patterns. So, so in addition to all the writing, and the photo and beautiful photos accompanying, you know, the essays, and typically I would go, just like I do here, I would go into like the history of the breed, the characteristics of the breed, the construction of the yarn, the decision-making going into the design, like why is this yarn good for this design? And so the chapters were, you know, usually 40 pages each or something. And I don't mean this to sound like a brag, but but often I have to go back into them when we're doing like a related fiber, or I might want to get information for more recent Barn Box talks. I go back into some of those chapters. They're really interesting and fun to read. They're readable, but they contain a lot of information. And I think they cover a lot more on each breed than your normal breed book does. I gave myself the space and the time to really go into each one. I mean, probably overall the ebooks cover, I don't know, what would you say, Anne? Maybe 40 breeds or
Something like that. Every one of the Bare Naked collections has at least six items, it seems to me. Maybe the last ones were only 3 or 4, but that
yes.
was, I went back and bought the ones that I hadn't been able to be in the club, because they've just been so much fun to look at and refer back to. And then I have all those patterns.
Yeah. And so the Bare Naked books are the ones that relate to the undyed yarns and are more breed specific discussions. And the Fall in Full Color books are based on dyed yarns and kind of focus more on color and fiber quality and community, you know, collaboration with a dyer, collaboration with, you know, of putting the design and a color together. So while they're not breed discussions, they are really interesting too. So.
And my second question was, when you've talked about people that have flocks that they use both for meat and for wool.
Mhm.
So how do they decide, like, do they do the same thing with both sheep? Like, does one sheep, do they set them aside at birth and say, oh, this is a good wool sheep and this one's just going to be for meat? Or do they shear them for a couple years and then use them for meat? Or how does that work?
Well, typically the ewes are separated by their breeding ability. So where and any sheep that show characteristics that are not consistent with what you're shooting for, in terms of maybe their wool is rough, or it's not the right color, or they're not the right size, those are going to be market lambs, meaning death.
Lamb chops.
for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Food.
Lamb chops.
Right. And that's true of everybody who raises sheep. You know, undesirables get culled at lambing and butchered. Sometimes when they're sometimes lamb is the high-end product that you're going to get out of your sheep. And then past that, sheep who that are not getting pregnant will they usually give that three seasons, I guess, for a sheep to get pregnant. Most sheep, I think, can start producing, at around a year old or a year and a half. And they give them 3 tries, and then they get put off into the market. But those sheep might have developed good wool. So usually they will get sheared before they are sent to market. Some farms have a part of their program is to have a whole bunch of lambs that will be market lambs. So the whole intention of this birthing cycle is to get lamb's wool and lamb meat. So they won't live more than, I don't know, 6 to 12 months before they go off to market. And those are the ones where, like, they might lamb in the spring and then they go to market in October or November. And so that benefits the farm because they don't have to feed them in the winter. They can just take advantage of grasslands, and the whole thing is much, much more efficient. They don't have to go through like a second inoculation cycle. There's plenty of benefit to that being part of your program. I would think most larger communal and ranch concerns have a whole range of levels that they're working with to take advantage of the most optimal scenario at each level. I mean, if you've got really good fleece sheep, you want to keep breeding them until they aren't producing good fleece babies. So, but except for this Highland situation, it's rare that a farm is placing the wool quality above the meat quality. That's rare, but there are definitely specialty farms that are doing that, mostly with much smaller flocks.
Thanks.
In terms of colors, for instance, with the alpacas, there's a high desire and there's a high stakes in keeping alpaca colors pure by only allowing, brown ones to breed with brown ones and gray ones to breed, and especially the more rare colors like a true black, or the more dyeable color like white. You never want to breed a white alpaca or sheep with a colored one if you're trying to keep the offspring white. So there's a lot of management in that regard when it comes to wool as well.
So Anne, I have a question about, is the Peruvian Highland wool that we got, is that actually from Peru, or is it just from the Peruvian type sheep in the US? Or
as far as I didn't read anything that indicated that they're raised here. So
okay.
This is a sheep that is raised in Peru, in the Peruvian Highlands.
Okay.
And I'm coming to the understanding that while there is a breed that's called the Peruvian Highland sheep, that Peruvian Highland wool could be a mix of different breeds or crossbreeds that are not distinct in terms of genetics. It has piqued my curiosity to the point where I would, I'm going to keep working on this, but I've spent the last month, not every day, but looking for information that I haven't been able to find. Except the same 5 sentences pretty much everywhere, about it. So I would love to know more. I would love to know, all kinds of things about it, and I'll try. It's my favorite. It's one of my favorite things to do that I have very little time for, but
So we can consider it more a geographic name than a genetic name.
I don't know the answer to that. I
Oh,
don't have a definitive answer. It's definitely, there definitely is a breed that's called a Peruvian Highland sheep,
Okay.
but in the market, what people consider to be Peruvian Highland wool might not be just from that sheep. Just like in the wool market, merino is not a merino sheep, it's a merino type. So it's a wool that conforms to merino standards. It could be
Okay.
any wool. It could be a wool from a non-merino sheep or a crossbreed that conforms to merino standards. So while you can get some brokers to get you real pure merino wool, you do have to ask for it. Like
Gotcha.
it's assumed if you want it that merino type will do. So you have to be really clear if you're hunting for the genuine article.
Yeah. Like all those signs on labels that say 100% wool.
Or
Okay.
virgin wool. Yeah, or
Yeah.
virgin wool, whatever that is.
Yeah.
It's wool spun by virgins. I don't know. I know.
Somebody told me that virgin wool meant it had not been used previously in an old garment and hadn't been repurposed, but I don't know
Yeah,
if that's true.
there's a couple different definitions of it. And that's true. Like there is wool circulating in our textile industry that is a byproduct of other things.
Yeah.
So, and you wonder why people think wool is scratchy. That's just, or why they're allergic to it because it's been through hell. That's why.
Makes sense.
Much of what we put on our backs has been through some really rough treatment. So anyway, anybody else have a question or want to say anything? Or oh, go ahead.
I wanted to share, last Christmas, my husband very kindly gave me 75 grams of vicuña or vicuña, yarn that I made into a shawlette. And it's from Italy. It was made in Italy, processed in Italy. And the card, you can see the harsh conditions.
Yeah.
That on the card, and it says it was harvested and imported in accordance with the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. What do you know about that?
So vicuña are the pure, genetically pure alpaca animals. They only exist in small herds in the high steppe regions of the Andes. They are extremely rare, and they're highly protected because alpacas and llamas mate and produce offspring readily. They just crossbreed all the time. So the Huacaya alpaca, which is the alpaca we mostly get, which is in, 99% of the alpaca yarn that you're going to buy, is alpaca that at some point in its genetic history was crossbred with llamas. And that's how alpaca got its hair coat instead of just a fiber coat. So the pure vicuña alpaca doesn't have a hair coat. It only produces the soft fiber, and it's very delicate. It's like cashmere produced in Tibet. It's very hard to get. It's very hard to harvest. You have to have special dispensations and licenses. You have to be basically taken into the area. You can only, if you want to see it, and you can only get the fiber through very strictly controlled channels of production. It's really hard to get. It's no surprise that it's that you know, it's spun and woven in Italy because they do the best job. You know, when they make beautiful, beautiful textiles and yarns there. So there is in my chapter on alpacas, which I don't remember offhand which book it's in, I go into all the different alpaca animals. So there's the guanaco, and the llamas and guanacos and alpacas and vicuñas are the different versions of the camelids that belong to that family. And it's a lot of information in there, and it goes way back in the genetic history and everything. It's a pretty good chapter, if I remember correctly. And then in another book, there's another whole chapter about Suri alpacas. And I was, and the woman that we got we didn't spin the Suri alpaca yarn ourselves. We didn't have that custom spun. It was, we purchased it from someone who does her own custom spinning. So when she read the chapter that I wrote about Suri alpaca, she wrote to me and she was all excited. She said, "This is the best piece of writing about Suri alpacas that I've ever read. Is it okay if I present it at a conference that I'm going to?" Like the American Suri Alpaca Conference. I'm like, oh my God, okay, you know, feel a little weird about it, but it was really, really nice compliment. So so that chapter is also apparently worth looking into if you want to know about Suri alpacas.
Yeah. Thank
Uh,
you.
You're very welcome. Anybody else have a question or anything they want to share or?
Well, I have a question about patterns.
Okay.
You know, there's the ones that came with the newsletter and all. But I'm thinking about ice sparkles in this blue.
Oh, yeah, that'd be beautiful.
Do you think the cabling will take more yardage with this? Because it has, you know, those little movements. I just didn't want to run out of yarn.
Yeah. What are you thinking of making? A scarf or the wrap?
Scarf.
Or
A scarf.
and how much how many skeins do you have? Do you have two?
I could have two. I bought extra for a sweater, but now I'm thinking might have to make the sweater first, so I see how much is left over.
Yeah, you won't need a full 2 skeins, but probably 1.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. I just don't know how to judge the pattern for yardage, you know.
What, I don't have it in front of me, but do you have it in front of you?
No.
I do.
Oh,
The yard, it's 475 yards.
And the
no, for
small, the small
in the
scarf,
pack.
the smallest scarf is 400 yards.
400.
Oh,
Should
okay.
work for the,
Yeah.
it says it will work for the small scarf.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I just didn't know because you said it did take maybe more yardage than you expected for David's sock. That
Yeah.
I don't
And-
want my scarf to be too
and
short.
David's sock is big too. I mean, it's normally for his
That is
socks.
big.
Yeah. He has big fat feet. They're not like he doesn't wear a big shoe size, but they're so wide that they take up a lot of and I made the leg on his longer than the pattern states. So the, you know, lots of people don't make their leg anywhere near as long as I do. Normally I can knit him a sock with like 450 yards, and I needed probably 475 or so to finish it. I did have to I did have to use leftovers from my sample skein to finish it, but they are really big socks.
They are, yes, okay, thank you.
Um, okay. Anybody else? Couple announcements. Let's see. For those who didn't participate in the Yarn Discovery Tour, it ends today. So the new pattern that was exclusive to the tour will be available to everyone now. And that'll be featured in our newsletter this week. It's a cowl, color work cowl. In just a little more than 2 weeks, we'll be exhibiting at the New York State Sheep and Wool Show, otherwise known as Rhinebeck. So we'll be in Building C, booth 36. We'll be bringing everything we can fit in the truck or fit in the booth, all the new samples, some favorites, old favorites, all the newest yarns and old favorites. And please come and see us. Even if you already have more yarn than you need, please come and say hello. We love to talk to people during the show. And if you live in the area or even if you don't, it's very, very worth going to. It should be lots of fun. And I think we're gonna have some true fall weather for this show. It looks like temperatures are gonna stay low, like medium low in the 60s and 50s. For the next couple weeks. So it should be, apple season will be on, and it'll be really, really fun. After that, we have, when we get back, we have just a few days to get our bearings, and we'll be rolling out the Red Scarf fundraiser, which features our Festivus yarns and our special Festivus pattern collection, which is myself and 9 other designers contributing designs to raise money for our scholarship fund, which is distributed by Foster Care to Success. So that's a scholarship that goes to more than one foster kid at this point, who wants to complete college. So foster kids who are aging out of the system don't have families to send them to college, so they rely on scholarships and funding from other places, including us. And honestly, like every year we manage to raise more money. Last year was a spectacular amount, and I hope we can hit the 20K mark this year. That would be like so great. Yeah. We ordered more yarn this year than last year. So we run out of yarn every year, by the way. So once the Festivus yarn comes out, it's a good idea to get right on that and buy it. That'll be coming up, and then we'll be having a Red Scarf knit along to go with that, starting in November and extending into December. So that's a great time to get on board and knit 1 or 2 accessory projects for gift giving or for to wear yourself at holiday events. And of course, Black Friday comes in between there somewhere too. So there's a busy, busy fall season advancing upon us. And hopefully you'll all come along with us. All right, I'll see you in 2 months or on Wednesday, whatever. All right. So long, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.